Now we'll get to the plan. So what to do? For this we have Matteo, who you already just met, and also Paul Hodgson, which was also in the panel early on, that will give us the plan, what to do now, in 5 years, in 10 years' time. Looking forward to see it. So please give them a hand.
So, yeah, we've talked about a lot of things, right? So what's left to discuss? This is a bit of an experiment. So we're doing live for you. So he's a scientist, I'm not a scientist, and we're going to try to be a team and talk about complex things, but in a way that's interactive. So I'm a bit like in the Obama press conference when he had an anger translator. So I'm translating what he says in, I guess, short
real time.
Yeah. So I'm the timekeeper. Paul, shall we start with AIA? What is it?
Sure. I think one thing. This is definitely one thing we haven't touched on today. So, the Aviation Impact Accelerator is a global systems change organisation based out of the University of Cambridge, between the Whittle Lab and Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. We drive change through holistic systems models and convening of global expertise across government, industry, and academia to drive the transition to sustainable aviation. And we do this through holistic systems models. These go from resource generation, so land use, biomass availability, electricity generation, through fuel conversion to conventional and novel fuels, how those fuels are distributed to airports, how those fuels are used in airports, put into conventional and future aircraft, and flown as efficiently as possible, ideally, to the climate impact at the end. So broadly, what we cover is resource to climate. And as a result, we actually have to have low-order models of adjacent sectors so that we can understand the interactions of resources and synergies with other sector uses. Now, we're an impact-driven organisation, and so we engage directly with government and industry to help decision makers understand and give them the tools required to make some of the difficult decisions that are required in sustainable aviation. You can see some of our partners here, and perhaps most importantly, Matteo from contrails.org on the topic of contrails. And today we want to talk to you about a program called Operation Blue Skies. This is the first of 4 goals set out in the AIA's seminal 2030 Sustainable Aviation Goals. You can read the report on our website. There's a long and short version for those that have not enough time or too much time on their hands. The Operation Blue Skies obviously looks at the elimination of contrails and the plan to do so over the next 5 to 10 years. The other goals discuss how to make aviation fuels truly sustainable, how to cut fuel burn by 50% by 2050, and how to make game changers have a chance in aviation through the use of moonshots.
Well, why should we pay attention to this session? It's because I think it goes back to what I was pointing to Larissa, but she's not sitting here anymore. Sorry, Alejandra. Larissa told us what is actually happening. Okay. Well, I think it's fair to say that AIA with Operation Blue Skies has really tried to answer that question. So, what to pay attention to in this session is, this is what you can take away in terms of, if someone asks you, what are we doing? What's the plan? You seem to think we can go faster than what other people say. You seem to think we can solve this. Okay, what is the plan? This could be one of the plans. So, first thing is, Jan told us we are here in the mother of all bubbles. I love that expression. So we step outside, no one knows about contrails. By the way, people say, I'm sure you've heard it, is aviation, sustainable aviation even possible? And even, why do we care? It's like, what, 2%, 3%, something like that of climate change. And contrails, don't joke, it must be like nothing, right? So how do we burst the mother of all bubbles, Paul?
Yeah, so this is a common misconception, and so we use this chart a lot, and there's Christiana presented a similar chart earlier today. So we're going to look at the impact of contrails on an equilibrium temperature scale. So this is after the transience of the planet, so it takes a while for the planet to warm up, what temperature the planet would equilibrium to after a certain amount of warming. And for scale reference, what I've done is I've plotted the scale between +0 and +0.5 degrees. So that's the difference between where we are today, which is broadly 1.5 degrees, and 2 degrees, which is, we've agreed as a society under the Paris Agreement, is an unacceptable level that we must not cross. And so first what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at aviation CO2 on that spectrum. And so you've seen these two lines earlier today. Aviation adds actually more and more CO2 to the environment every single year. And the black curve is all of CO2, the warming that's causing from the CO2 that's been emitted since 1940, the beginning of the aviation era. And you can see that the dotted line is the CO2 that we've already committed to, the CO2 before today's date. And the reason I raise that is there's a bit of a gambler's fallacy sometimes going on when we compare CO2 to contrails, which is the historic CO2 is done. Like, we can't do anything about that. The only decisions we can make on CO2 are about future CO2, and that's the difference between these two dotted lines. And in 2050, the total CO2 will be responsible eventually for about 0.07 degrees of warming from aviation, about half of which is from future aviation emissions. So on decarbonisation, that's the chunk available to us.
So just to make sure everyone understands. So here we have, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have the CO2 in 2050 emitted by aviation, whether historical ends from now until 2050, is projected to be responsible for around 0.07 degrees Celsius of warming. Correct?
That's absolutely right.
Clear? Good.
Let's add back in our contrail line, which I'm going to plot on red. And today you can see we have a fair amount of uncertainty as the warming in 2018. That's the kind of Lee et al. Figure that's quite famous. That's, if those contrails persisted, those would be responsible for about 0.05 degrees of warming. Now there's a big uncertainty, as you can see there. But contrails don't scale with fuel burn. We're expecting aviation to improve on efficiency because we're going to bring in new aircraft and then even more new aircraft later than that. And that means per kilometre flown, the CO2 goes down. But contrails broadly scale with kilometres flown. And so contrails by 2050 are therefore expected to be responsible for over 1/10 of a degree of warming eventually. So that's 20% of that gap between 1.5 and 2 degrees.
I just want to make sure that's clear for everyone as well. So 0.07 degrees Celsius is the CO2. The contrails is 0.1 degrees. And on top of that, you're saying if you look at the gap between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees, 0.1 is 20% of that. So it's a big chunk of the divide between a not great scenario and a catastrophic scenario, right?
Yeah, and I don't see any pathways to 2 degrees that are really possible without taking this 0.1 degrees out. It is already very, very difficult with carbon to stay under 2 degrees. Now, there is a big uncertainty. Uncertainty's a real worry because people are always attached to what happens if it's the bottom end of the uncertainty. I'd like to remind people that by definition it's equally likely it's the top end of the uncertainty. And this is either quite a big problem or a really big problem. And so actually, it probably doesn't matter which end of the spectrum we are at, we have to deal with this problem.
So that's a good scene setting in terms of why it matters. I think, I hope you got a lot of the good sort of speaking points here. I think they are really great. Thank you, Paul. What do we do now?
So the plan that we outline has been touched on today. It's called Operation Blue Skies. And this fundamentally says that the next step that we need to deal with in contrail mitigation is to set up 3 to 4 airspace scale living labs to learn by doing. And we've heard this expression of learn by doing a few times today. And just to explain what that involves, there are kind of 4 characteristics we think are required for living labs. The first is distribution. So we've heard today that climate varies around the world, airspace varies around the world, rules vary around the world. And so it's likely that several labs are required around the world, strategically selected to represent those diverse conditions. The second is that those labs actually need to end up at a scale that accurately reflects the real-world complexities at play. So these are networks, how moving one aircraft impacts with another. For instance, what Christoph talked about running trials, for instance, in the summer, etc., in order that we understand the real-world implications for doing contrail mitigation. The third is that we have to do experiments of sufficient quality to convince decision makers that we're doing the right thing. And so labs must be conducted in a way in which they ensure statistical significance, which, by the way, the scale actually helps quite a lot with, that we have independent verification, i.e. we don't just believe one individual, and that include kind of standard scientific things like controls, like making sure that we prove demonstrably that the measures have mitigated a contrail. And finally, then there needs to be a transparent review process in that, and that will involve a whole range of principles from data sharing, peer review and publication, and oversight by independent NGOs.
Okay, so that's a great theory. In practice, give us an example of a great trial.
Yeah, so Matteo and I are sadly disappointed that there was a program Matteo and I and others looked at in Europe that sadly didn't get funding, that should have started this year, which was scaled up to 10,000 flights in Europe by 2030. We would ideally like contrail avoidance schemes on a kind of significant period of airspace, so some hundreds of kilometers across, for a period of a week or more at a time, and so that we can examine these real-world effects.
So, like, let's say Scotland, for a few weeks in what season?
Well, we probably would need to run it in multiple seasons because of reflecting those climatic conditions, and we might run it as some weeks of avoiding contrails, and then some weeks possibly of deliberately forming contrails, so that we can prove that detecting contrails is actually easier than detecting the lack of contrails. So some of these trials might involve actually deliberately forming the contrails temporarily in order to prove that we're working.
So hopefully that's clear in terms of what a trial looks like. When does it happen? What's the timeline?
So we've had a look at the timeline to achieve this overall, and we believe these living labs have to be completed by 2030, so within the next 5 years. And the reason this will become clear, we think it's possible to do in that time frame, but there are lots and lots of uncertainties that follow after this, because the point of learning by doing is we probably don't know the exact answers to how things operate beyond that. Now, there may be very few system changes required, or perhaps even none, but it's maybe possible that we need things like additional LEO satellites in order to do the monitoring verification. That takes some time to put those into place.
LEO satellite, can you explain?
Oh, low Earth orbit satellites that give us a better resolution on the problem. And that may take some years to implement, and we won't know for sure whether we need them or not until we run some trials. Then we've heard a lot about how we may need some degree of policy to incentivize action, because whilst the costs are minimal, like competitive costs with airlines make it very difficult to enforce things without some degree of policy or some degree of action. And then actually it takes time to scale things up from one region to the world. It takes time to make changes. This involves lots and lots of people. And we don't know between this top timescale and this bottom timescale how long it's going to take. And so it may be that we can get this scaled up before 2040. But we actually don't know, without running the living labs, whether actually it might take a longer time and actually take to 2050 to actually be at full scale. We'll have started before then, but we won't be finished until 2050. And the only way for us to know this is through the living labs. Now, this is what our model tells us, that if we look at these timelines, what the proportion of persistent contrails avoided are over time, and you can see there's also an uncertainty there about how effective things like predictions might end up, etc.
So I want to make sure this is clear for everyone, because we told people why this matters, why they can burst the mother of all bubbles. We've talked about what a good large-scale trial looks like. Timeline-wise, okay, I think the red part is clear, so it needs to start now. The large-scale trials, the living labs. What's a bit confusing is the whole thing in the middle. Like, a politician is gonna, probably zone out after 10 seconds looking at this. When do we say this actually starts? When can the politician or the climate leader say we've reached the results, and that can't be 2050? I think you can agree.
Yeah. So I think under this under this plan, operational contrail avoidance would effectively start in the early 2030s at best and be completed by 2037 at best. We actually need to do as much as we can to parallelize some of these processes, so looking at the system changes that might be required now, and equally looking at some of the policy implications that we might have now so that we can best minimize those times beyond trials.
And just another question for you on trials. Can you explain to the audience, trials is a word that we're hearing all the time. It's like research, it's like uncertainty. How can they prove, or how can they say that this is going to be a trial that really makes a difference? What do you do once you have the result of that? How can you be sure that suddenly people are going to say, oh, that trial really made a difference, really we've demonstrated it?
So the trials need to be what we would kind of call in chemical engineering pilot scale, where people can see that we're doing the operation as we would do it for the entire of the aviation system, i.e. at scale. So we've seen lots of trials or experiments at the moment that are on individual flights or individual networks. We haven't seen them as much operating on that whole system. There are some benefits of doing them at airspace level, which it actually does help quite a lot with the statistical verification that works. It's easier to detect that regions of contrails statistically are lower empirically than trying to do the individual matching of flights, which can be sometimes challenging under certain conditions. And so this all adds to a body of evidence, but I think the most important is people feel that we've done a trial where we can say, well, basically all we need to do is just do that, not just for the trial length, we need to do it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Like a test run, that you can then scale up.
Yes.
Okay, so we are going to talk about myths, right?
Yes. So very quickly, I was going to just show you the implication of that on our temperature plot. You can see that reduction substantially reduces that temperature change.
Okay, so it makes the operate well. Can we say that's a good question actually? Can we say this is solving the problem? Yeah, because with CO2 you can say 2050 we aim at net zero. I mean, easy to say, harder to do. But let's say people can just write it down. What's the equivalent for contrails? Do you say you're solving the contrails problem?
Yeah, so contrails has a huge benefit in that we can wind back the clock. On CO2, the CO2 we've already emitted, we've kind of embedded into our climate systems for like 1,000 years. Contrails is a problem where we really can kind of wind back the clock of the damage we've done. It takes a couple of decades for it to fade out on the temperature plots, but it's a problem we can really wind back the clock. The only equivalent really is carbon removals. That's the only real equivalent to contrail reduction.
So what is a satisfactory solving of the problem? Is it 80%? Is it 90%? Is it less? What sort of?
Well, I mean, ultimately, we kind of need to get to net zero at some point.
Yeah.
So obviously, ultimately, we need to eliminate that. Now, the less we're able to eliminate, the more we will have to rely on doing more and more removals to counterbalance that problem. So we're actually very motivated financially to get this to as close to zero as possible, ultimately.
So we thought we were going to also open the door and bring in some myths, because these are the ones that supposedly, even after you've made this pitch, people would still say. For example, that's really great, Paul, but that's never going to happen, because aviation can only change like a glacier, like slowly, centimeter by centimeter.
Yeah, this is quite a persistent myth, and I have a story that hopefully will change your mind on this. So in 1965, Pan Am Airways came to Boeing and said that we've got this idea that if we had a bigger long-haul aircraft, we could revolutionize ticket costs and we'd dominate the market. And Boeing agreed, and in August of 1965, they appointed Joe Sutter, who was very successful in a previous Boeing program, to be chief engineer of that program and started that aircraft program. 6 months later, the board of Boeing went through final investment decision for that project, but they realized that they actually didn't have a factory big enough to build this aircraft. And so they purchased a bunch of land, actually really in the middle of nowhere in Washington State, near a place called Everett. And they broke ground and construction of that factory on June 17th, 1966. 10 months after they construct, on May the 1st, 1967, Everett factory opens. Everett factory is the largest building ever constructed by mankind, and it was constructed in 10 months. This is Everett factory. 4 years and 5 months after they start the program, the aircraft enters into service with Pan Am on their New York-London route on January the 22nd, 1970. Now, those that are familiar with this story might know what this aircraft is. This is the 747. It's the most iconic aircraft arguably ever built and was king of the skies for 50 years. And Boeing went from conception to in-service in 4 years and 5 months. It is not a question of whether aviation can do things quickly. It is a question of what the priorities are.
Yeah, but you know, my grandparents always said, you know, things used to be better in the past, right? And especially, well, no comment. But
we have more people than ever, so more people to solve the problems.
What would you say if someone says, well, that was easy in the 1960s, things are different now, so great example, great history, granddad, but that's not really going to work?
Well, I mean, I think we've built on the shoulders of giants, like the knowledge that we have from the 60s, we have now, and we have even more people work in aerospace than ever before. So arguably we have the manpower and the expertise to solve some of these challenges.
Okay, so myth number 2, that's one that I think everyone has heard here. Additional fuel burn might outweigh the benefits of contrail mitigation. That one is for those who have not heard of it, this one is really important, because no one wants to do a cure that is worse than the disease, right? No one wants to make the problem worse. So oftentimes, I think it's objective of me to say that some people are pushing back or putting basically even a red line saying, I'm not going to do anything on contrails because I don't want to make the problem worse. What's your answer?
So I wouldn't have highlighted it as a myth if it was obviously true. This is a chart we use to explain this quite a lot. So previously we saw that the temperature rise, but with a baseline, etc. And so all I've done here is I've plotted the savings in temperature that will make for contrail emissions. So I've just moved that baseline effectively to be 0, and that's why we're seeing a temperature reduction due to turning contrails off. Okay, and there's a bunch of different uncertainty. We've talked around the business as usual, relative to business as usual, contrail mitigation on average will be responsible for about 1/10 of a degree by 2050. We know there's different bits of uncertainty. There's some engineering uncertainty in how well and how effective scale up is of contrail avoidance. And then there's a scientific uncertainty as to how large the impact of contrail how large the impact of contrails are. Now, one thing that you might not have noticed on the screen is there is a second line in red, which is the fuel burn penalty. And unfortunately, on this scale, you can't see it. You can see there's just a really thin red line at the top, but you can't see it.
What does that mean?
So to help you see it, I'm gonna zoom in and put the fuel burn penalty on the top plot. But so that you can see it, I'm going to zoom in on that plot by a factor of 1,000. So the scale on the top plot is 1,000 times bigger than the one on the bottom plot. And for those that are interested, the fuel burn penalties we're plotting here are 0.5% on fleet average. Actually, most of the trials you've heard about today have found that that's probably an upper end, if anything. There's arguments about whether you scale it up to lots and lots of flights. Some extremists argue that you might have higher fuel burn penalties. But even if we took 2% fuel burn penalties, we can see that the scale of these is the same when we put them on a scale 1,000 to 1. So the savings made through contrail mitigation are at least 100 times higher, if not 1,000 times higher than the fuel burn penalty. There is no comparison between fuel burn penalties and contrail mitigation. I think the reason that people sometimes think there is we keep telling people that CO2 and contrails are a similar magnitude. But that means by definition, if we're talking about a 1% of the CO2, that has got to be in the order of magnitude of 100 times smaller than contrails.
Is that clear to everyone? Because this is a very important chart. Any clarification needed? Yes?
Just because you invited, I think I can talk without a microphone. Does that not have the assumption that you can direct the extra fuel consumption exactly towards the contrails, regarding the discussions we had before about the positive, the false positives and so on?
That's a great question. So actually in this uncertainty and the contrail mitigation, that already has built in some of the failure to mitigate contrails. That's why it's not 100% effective here. The study in the paper that we discussed includes the impact of missing contrails, but actually even when we include that, we don't actually get up to a 2% fuel burn penalty. And the last thing I should note is that, as I mentioned earlier, the fuel burn penalty is really hypothetical. It's effectively the penalty between a perfect flight that doesn't exist and a flight that perfectly follows contrail avoidance. Actually, neither of those two things really exist. And actually, I don't think we will be able to measure the contrail fuel burn penalty when measuring operational fuel burn. We'll be able to measure it looking at flight plans, but not like in the noise of movements of aircraft.
So for the record, just for the cameras, the question was, rephrasing it myself, but basically, is this the ideal scenario of extra fuel burn, or are you taking into account all the fuel burn, even on flights where you've not been able to avoid a contrail, but you've still burned extra fuel? And, well, I don't need to repeat the answer. Just one final question from my side on the slide we showed before. So you're in the business of truth. You're a scientist.
Hopefully.
Why? So sorry, this is a very genuine question. We haven't staged that one. Why is it that you show that it's clear? I mean, people didn't even need any clarifications, and we still have this myth flying around. I just can't understand that.
Well, I mean, I'd say it's partly, I think, that confusion about us talking about the size of CO2 and contrails, which is one of the reasons that people, I think, misunderstand that in the first place. But, you know, there's hundreds of people in this room. This needs to be socialized to a lot more people. And, you know, there's arguments about whether people have the best intentions sometimes when making excuses of not wanting to act. We
count on you then. We talk about myths, but there are some challenges. Like let's not assume that everything is going to be easy. In fact, things are going to be challenging. What are the quote-unquote real challenges, the one that we should focus on because we're not distracted by those myths?
Yeah, and obviously there are many challenges, and these are probably not exhaustive, but Matteo and I and the AI and Contrails.org have done a lot of work trying to categorize some of the challenges, and we think there are these kind of 4 major buckets of challenges. So the first is congested skies. You can see here a re-representation of some of the work that was shown earlier on the kind of star chart, which is how bad contrails are versus how bad congestion is. And unfortunately, where most of the world's worst contrails are also, unsurprisingly, where most of the congestion is. There are some exceptions or partial exceptions. The North Atlantic has slightly less bad traffic and also really bad contrails, and so might be an easier target from that perspective. But permission for avoidance arguably could have limitations in busy airspace. This we need to experiment with through the living labs, and obviously partial alleviation could be done by modernization of air traffic and increased air traffic control capacity.
So in a one sentence answer for each, why is it not a showstopper? What's the next steps?
Well, for a start, there are lots of airspace for lots of time that aren't congested, so clearly we can deal with contrails in those regions. Airspace has always got more and more congested, and we've always found solutions to make airspace less congested. So fundamentally, this is not a showstopper, it's just something we need to be aware of and work through.
And next steps?
Probably some synthetic trials would help with this, and obviously the practical trials to understand this problem better.
Right.
So the second is incentivizing operators or policy to ensure operators behave. One of the challenges is, whilst the uplift on ticket costs for contrail avoidance we find to be around 1% or less, the uncertainty is not very clear on here because it doesn't make that much difference. As Nikhil said, mostly driven by the fuel burn penalty. Airlines are hyper-competitive between airlines, even if aviation as a total is not massively sensitive to cost. And that means that either we need regional or global incentivizations or policy schemes, or possibly being ANSP-led, so that it doesn't really involve yes or no's in those instances.
Can you just explain what that means? So how can people use this number here?
So we can see that we project that the average return ticket cost in 2050, if it remained under fossil fuels, would be $228, and we think that ticket costs would rise by approximately $3 on average return flight by implementing contrail avoidance, which is mostly due to the additional fuel cost, which is relatively small. So the third challenge is measuring the absence of contrails, and Adam Durant spoke about this earlier, that it's much easier to measure a contrail that exists than it is to measure a ghost. This is less of a problem during trials, because there are things we can do during trials to run a control aircraft to see that contrail or do other things. but it's slightly more challenging in operation, where we don't want to form any contrails. We don't want to check that contrails are being not formed by forming contrails. Now, there are lots more research being done in this, and there are ways of structuring policy rather than kind of rewarding absences. For instance, you can penalize formation, or you could measure contrail formation and see what the kind of total contrail formation is region. It's probably a longer conversation about some of the methods, but it's something that we just need to be aware of. I think this is a particularly sticky issue around reporting and verification.
But it makes then the credit system we were talking about more difficult, right?
Potentially, I think there are workarounds. You can kind of always kind of make some of them work. We just have to be careful about the construction.
So you're not too concerned.
I think this is a fixable problem, but it just needs some thought.
Good.
And finally, one that engineers like myself often understate, because we're obsessed with fixing things through technology, is that the aviation industry is made up of thousands of workers, all of whom will need system changes, comprehensive retraining and education to get the buy-in to actually operate contrail avoidance. And so we mustn't forget that this is not just a kind of sticker technology on a winglet and everything is sort of solved. This actually mostly involves people.
Which is actually a good thing, because every time we've done trials, there's been, of course, a lot of thought into how to explain it, to present it, but every time it's been seen as a very good thing within an airline, within an NSP. It's gotten people to be excited about it. So I would say the human factor is actually an asset if it's taken in the right way.
No, absolutely.
We had the last myth, right? Just
we
to
do.
give you this present. Contrails are too complex to solve. This is probably when someone has used all the possible counter arguments, and you've been great and standing your ground, and then they go well, anyways, it's too complex. Bye. What do you respond to that?
Yeah. So perhaps this is the most kind of worrying, that maybe contrails are just too complicated or too messy to kind of solve. And I have another story that I hope helps with this. So this is a turbine blade from a jet engine. For scale, it would roughly fit in the palm of your hand. This is a miracle of engineering made possible by some of the world's best scientists and engineers. So for those that aren't familiar with how a jet engine works, in less than a second, a jet engine ingests around 1,000 kilos of air. That's, for reference, a little bit more than the air in this room. It squashed it down to a 50th of its size, passing over hundreds of blades spinning at 10,000 revolutions per minute. It injects kerosene into that air and burns it to produce combustion gases around a third of the temperature of the surface of the sun. And those combustion gases hurtle towards a wall of turbine blades at speeds of 1,500 kilometers an hour. These miracles of engineering have to operate in unimaginable conditions. They're operating at hundreds of degrees above their own melting points, and the centrifugal forces involved are equivalent to hanging the weight of a double-decker bus off every turbine blade. The job of each of these turbine blades is to produce the thrust equivalent to a Formula One engine. They have to do this day in and day out for 30 years with as minimal maintenance as possible. And the exact design and shape of these blades, the compressor blades and the turbine blades, are responsible for an efficiency drive on engines that's responsible for billions, not millions, of tons of CO2 saved over the jet age, all while improving reliability and safety by 2 orders of magnitude. This has been made possible by the engineering that's gone into aerospace. We have pumped the best engineers and scientists into the aviation sector for generations. There's a reason for the expression, it's not exactly rocket science. Contrails are a solvable problem. I hope today that we've shown you that contrails are a solvable problem, and that not only is it solvable, that it's an imperative problem to solve. It would be a betrayal of the talent, the prestige, and the faith that we have put in the aviation industry if we do not solve this problem. Now, I hope today that you've all caught contrail fever and that you won't let others use myths and excuses to stop us from reaching blue skies.